Back in the Intel days, the Mac Mini's small stature resulted in huge performance trade-offs. In the past, you could have had a small footprint or you could have had high performance, but you generally couldn't have both. Apple Silicon has totally changed the game in that respect, and that's further emphasized with the release of the Mac Mini featuring M2 Pro. One of the most appealing aspects of the Mac Mini is its overall flexibility. It's less than half the size of a Mac Studio, doesn't feature a built-in display, and can be placed pretty much anywhere, on a desktop, mounted under a desk, on the back of a monitor, on a wall, etc. I personally like to mount my Mac Mini under my desk using a relatively inexpensive mount that I purchased on Amazon. Coupled with the monitor arm that I have paired with the Pro Display XDR, the Mac Mini further simplifies my minimalistic desktop working environment. The idea of editing video, playing games, or basically doing any other graphics-intense operation on a standalone Intel Mac Mini, yeah, that was pretty much a laughable concept. But Apple Silicon has really changed things. Of course, Apple's M2 system-on-a-chip provides a modest bump over the original M1 chip, while the M2 Pro provides an even more noticeable performance leap. The M2 Pro version of the Mac Mini gives its CPU 2 additional performance cores in addition to its 4 efficiency cores for a total of 10 cores. The M2 Pro also provides an additional 6 GPU cores over the baseline M2 machine for a total of 16 GPU cores. That's actually double the amount of GPU cores found on the original M1 Mac Mini from 2020. So that's going to be a pretty significant performance increase from a graphics perspective. For video editors, especially those working with ubiquitous H.265 video, the M1 chip with its hardware acceleration for HEVC provided a huge performance boost and made it viable to edit video on the Mac Mini, which was basically unheard of unless you paired the Intel version with an eGPU, and that sort of defeated the purpose of the Mac Mini's small stature to begin with. And the M2 chips, even the standard M2, builds on this foundation by providing a higher bandwidth video decode engine that supports 8K H.264 and HEVC, and hardware acceleration for both ProRes and ProRes RAW up to 8K. What does this actually mean though? Well, it means that when I try to play back an 8K ProRes clip on an M1 machine, like the iMac for instance, the CPU is doing all the heavy lifting instead of the dedicated hardware accelerators found on the M2. Because the M1 machines don't have enough cores to throw at the problem, it causes the whole machine to slow down, which affects productivity. On the M2 and M2 Pro, I can play back ProRes video and you'll notice that the CPU stays relatively quiet. Instead of doing all the heavy lifting, the dedicated ProRes accelerators do the job instead. This allows the CPU to do other more important things like rendering Finder windows or rendering the Final Cut Pro interface, multitasking, etc. So the result is a much smoother and usable experience when working with high resolution ProRes video. So if you're in the video and you have something like a Canon R5 or an R5C and you pair it with an Atomos Ninja V Plus, which is an external recorder, you'll be able to record 8K ProRes RAW files directly to an external SSD. So these M2 upgrades make the Mac Mini, especially if you decide to configure an 8TB SSD, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it makes this machine a viable candidate for such a workflow, which is kind of absurd when you think about it. Back when the 2018 Intel Mac Mini refresh launched, I labeled it as the most versatile Mac in existence, and its 4 Thunderbolt ports played a major role in it gaining that designation. So when the M1 Mac Mini launched in 2020 with just 2 Thunderbolt ports, I considered it to be a downgrade of sorts. While the base M2 Mac Mini again sports just 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, the M2 Pro version has 4. Having 4 Thunderbolt ports not only means that you can connect more physical devices to the Mac Mini with M2 Pro, but it also provides more available Thunderbolt bandwidth as each port is paired to its own dedicated bus. This means that you'll be able to connect more high-performance devices such as OWC's Thunderblade SSDs, which require a lot of bandwidth and shouldn't really be used with Thunderbolt hubs of any sort. Besides that, there are just tons of Thunderbolt/USB devices available that you can connect to these ports, and having 4 of them just makes this machine that much more convenient. Like the M1 Mac Mini, the M2 Mac Mini features 8GB of memory in its base configuration with up to 24GB configurable in its build-to-order specs. The M2 Pro starts with 16GB of memory and can be customized up to 32GB for $400 more. For me, 8GB of memory is a huge bottleneck for my video-centric workflow, so having 16GB as the baseline in the M2 Pro adds some much-needed breathing room. The M2 chips also provide a big leap in memory performance, going from just shy of 70GB a second of memory bandwidth on the M1 Mac Mini to 100 and 200GB per second respectively on the M2 and the M2 Pro. And with Apple Silicon's unified memory structure, that's going to contribute to better performance across the board. Now, unlike previous Intel models, which could be upgraded with off-the-shelf SO-DIMM modules, you're stuck with whatever you configure on Apple Silicon machines. I even found myself running up against the constraints of my 16GB base model M2 Pro Mac Mini when working with high-resolution 8K video in Final Cut Pro. I'd recommend configuring your machine with a max 32GB of memory, especially if you plan on using it for any sort of creative tasks like video or photo editing. Otherwise, you run the risk of having your Mac page out to its SSD when it runs out of memory, slowing you down in the process. The amount of storage that Apple allows users to configure speaks to how it views a particular machine. Creative-focused Macs usually have access to larger amounts of SSD storage in build-to-order specs, and that holds true with the M2 Pro Mac Mini. While the baseline M2 version maxes out at only 2TB of storage, the M2 Pro lets you configure up to 8TB of storage, which is the highest amount of storage that Apple features on any of its other high-end machines, including the Mac Pro. Given the fact that the M2 Pro Mac Mini plays nice with 8K ProRes RAW files, which feature downright absurd file sizes, it makes sense that Apple gives users the option for higher tier storage. Clearly, Apple sees the M2 Pro Mac Mini as a creator-driven machine that warrants a cavernous amount of onboard storage. Now, with all that said, if you're opting for the entry-level M2 Mac Mini, you have to be aware that the SSD speed is actually pretty pathetic. Now, this did cause quite a bit of controversy when the M2 Mac Mini was first released. It probably won't affect most users, but if you know this would be a bottleneck to your workflow, then it's definitely something to keep in mind. If you own a Wi-Fi 6E enabled router, such as Amazon's Eero Pro 6E, then you'll be able to take advantage of the new Wi-Fi 6E capability present in the new Mac Mini. Even Apple's previous M2 powered machines, the MacBook Air and 13-inch MacBook Pro, lacked Wi-Fi 6E capability. Unlike regular Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E gains access to the 6 GHz frequency band, which can be described as sort of a fast lane for compatible devices. To see if your Mac is connected to this band, simply hold the Option key on your keyboard while clicking the Wi-Fi icon in the menu bar. Doing so reveals advanced Wi-Fi connectivity details, including the channel, frequency band, transfer rate, and more. In real-world usage, I noticed that both upload and download speeds were much faster when connected to the 6 GHz band. The big downside, you'll have to spend more money on a Wi-Fi 6E compatible router, as normal Wi-Fi 6 routers can't utilize that 6 GHz band. All of Apple's M2 Pro machines include support for 8K output via HDMI, and that's a first for Apple hardware. Unfortunately, there aren't any desktop displays that I know of that can support 8K input via HDMI. So you'll most likely have to opt for connecting to an 8K television if you're interested in testing out the Mac Mini's 8K output. And you know what? That's exactly what I did. I called up TCL. I was like, hey, I'm reviewing the Mac Mini. It has 8K output. Could you loan me one of your 6 Series 8K QLED TVs? And they said, yeah. So that's what I did. I have this TCL television. I've connected my Mac Mini, and it works. 8K output worked as expected, with macOS immediately recognizing the connection and providing me with 8K display options within system settings. But the biggest issue with 8K at this juncture is that it's still so early in the game, and outside of various videos shot in 8K on YouTube, there's just very little 8K content to choose from. I've posted several 8K videos to 9to5Mac's YouTube channel in the past, and while they look extremely crisp and sharp on TCL's 8K Beast, YouTube videos aren't exactly the type of compelling content you'd purchase a $1,500 plus television for. I see the Mac Mini's current 8K support as more of a nod to what's to come in the future, not something that would make or break your purchase. While 8K support is interesting, I'm a bigger fan of having support for higher refresh rates on external displays via HDMI. M2 Pro machines like the Mac Mini and MacBook Pro can, for the very first time, officially drive external displays at higher refresh rates than 60 Hz. The previous M1 lineup of machines could only drive an external display at up to 6K at 60 Hz, and that was via Thunderbolt, not HDMI. Now users can connect to televisions and monitors and gain access to refresh rates up to 240 Hz at 4K. The scrolling experience when using these higher frame rates is closer to what you'll find on a ProMotion enabled display on today's 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro machines, and that's really cool. The Mac Mini, especially the M2 Pro version, is a solid machine for creatives. At just $12.99 for the M2 Pro version, you get a machine with the type of power that we could only dream about a Mac Mini having just a few short years ago. If you don't have the budget for higher spec Apple computers, the M2 Pro Mac Mini is a great value. That being said, the baseline M2 Mac Mini at just $599 is arguably an even better bang for the buck, but the slower CPU, slower GPU, lack of additional Thunderbolt I/O, limited memory, and storage options might serve as bottlenecks for some creatives. With that being said, keep in mind that you'll have to provide a monitor, keyboard, mouse and trackpad, speakers, so unless you already own these items, they will add to the cost. If you're looking at the Mac Mini because you need the cheapest Mac that you could buy, you would probably be better off opting for a refurbished M1 MacBook Air, which I think is probably still pound for pound the best value in Macs today. But there's no denying it, this Mac Mini is quite the compelling machine. What do you think? Let me know down below in the comments section with your thoughts. This is Jeff with 9to5Mac.